Hello and welcome to an episode of Flying High with Flutter. I'm your host, Alan Wyma. Today we have Yulian Kuncheff on the show. He's the creator, author of UUID package in, I guess you could say Dart, right? It's a pure Dart package, right?
Yes.
Yeah, so welcome to the show. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you for having me. It's my first podcast ever, so should be fun.
And you thought UUIDs were boring and nobody ever wants to hear about them, right?
Yeah, when you mentioned UUIDs, I'm like, of all the packages, why UUIDs?
Well, and I think I started to explain a bit, right? I'm a big proponent of UUIDs. I don't know, like I'm starting off like my career started off with kind of Rails, I think, for more professional side. And of course, there they start with integer IDs for the database. And that was all I knew. And I always thought in my mind, like, what if I run out? Like, there has to be like a limit. I think it's like billions or something, right? So it would take most applications some time, unless, of course, you were saving a ridiculous amount of stuff. But that always was in the back of my mind. And then the other thing that was also came to my mind was like, obviously you can start to guess records because they go sequential, right? And I got introduced to UIDs working at another company, and I thought this is ridiculous. You know, it's so long, so ugly. And then I asked, why are we using this? They said, well, for the exact reason about exhaustiveness. They didn't talk about the predictiveness, but I think that's definitely kind of a, what do you call that? What is it? Like it's like a byproduct or something. It's another plus, I would say. So people cannot always predict, but actually that was possible with previous versions of UUID, right? There's like 4, 5, 6 versions, I think.
Yeah, there's from the main spec, there's 5 of them, 1 through 5. One isn't really used nowadays. I think it was just the same as or UDV1 is the one, or it is used. I'm confusing two. One is used and it's time based. So you just use current time to increment part of it. Then you have a few little bits as counters and a little extra like information. And then there's like a random bit or a MAC, but there's like extra space for a random or extra information related to, like, you can use MAC addresses and such in order to like partition it based on like machines if you need to. And then there 2 was like, and 5 are the same except 2 uses MD5 and or no, 2 is the same as 4 but uses MD5. 4 uses SHA-1. I think it was off the top of my head. 3 and 5 are the same in terms of they have namespaces, but 3 is like MD5. It uses the generated number from 2, and then it namespaces it with like another, like a namespace UID to get like another output. 4 is completely random also, but with SHA, like instead of MD5, it uses SHA. And then 5 is the same as 3, where it has a namespace, but uses the 4 for its random bit instead of. So that's their relation. And now there's a new RFC that's currently almost done, being almost out of draft stage, which adds 6, 7, and 8, which are going to be kind of the future of UID. 6 kind of replaces 1. 7 kind of does a better version of 6 because 6 is for compatibility reasons, and 8 is a special one that can be vendor specific. It's just a completely like opens. You only just have to follow the format and put an 8 for the version, but all of the information could be whatever the person wants or the company or whatever. So 8 will not be the same between implementations. I don't think ever. Maybe a few here and there.
Well, the 8 sounds complicated because, I mean, basically people can start to kind of use the same prefix, right?
Well, 8 is designed to be something that you would use, like, say, internally within a company or on a personal project. It's not designed to be some kind of universal in between kind of solution. That's what 6 and 7 are for.
But that defeats the purpose of UUID, right? I think the first one is universal now. Universal Unique Identifier.
Well, I mean, so when I meant universal, I mean universal between implementations. So, like, if you generate UUID7 in Dart, it'll be the same UUID7 in the C# library and the same UUID7 in this other application, for example. For 8, let's say Gmail has their own implementation of UUID v8 that's not necessarily compatible or not generated the same way as, say, the Flutter implementation Like it's has this ambiguity to it while still maintaining a format that is compatible with each other. Like it'll still parse it as a UUID, but all of a sudden it won't have the same information per se in it. It's kind of a weird one in the whole spec. It's very nebulous.
You're blowing my mind over here. It's hard for me to keep track with the difference of them. I don't know how you can keep 8 different versions in your mind.
Because I've had to implement, or to be fair, two and three are no longer implemented nowadays. So I only know them because I read the spec. 1, 4, and 5 are the only ones that people implement, and 5 is not very popular, like the name spacing concept. Um, so 6, so 1 and 4 are really the most important ones, and then 6 and 7 are going to be important here in the future, and 8 will take the place of 5, I think, in the future also, because you can use the version 8 as a pseudo replacement for 5 by just following the same process. There's a lot to it. I mean, I've been maintaining the UID library for 10 years, so it's a lot of bugs and a lot of other stuff related to it.
What kind of bugs could you be getting? Is it there's like a timing attack or something?
Not really timing, but some of the bugs were mostly compatibility related stuff. One of the biggest problem is Google Authenticator. So when you generate a Google Authenticator, or sorry, I'm confusing this with another library. No, for UID, it's mostly just getting it right so that it matches the vectors in the spec, and it matches other ones. Like a few, it's mostly V1, for example. Different precision of time changes things. Like in JavaScript and Dart, you mostly have up to milliseconds of precision, but in other languages, you can go down to nanoseconds. You also have microseconds too in Dart, but like that precision changes certain aspects of the UID information that you can generate. Like for the ones that can go to nanoseconds, they don't have to deal with clock sequences in the clock sequence part of the UID. While if you do milliseconds, you do have to do a counter, a mandatory counter in order to handle uniqueness and collision. And for version 4, it's just the random seed. Like when implementing this, I kind of implemented in a very kind of functional manner where you just call the function, get a UID. There's no objects in state and such. But as the thing got bigger and Dart changed over the years, now everyone wanted more object-oriented kind of design. And then you also have to deal with state and statelessness and just those kind of bugs. There's nothing, not a bug in the actual like UID or the spec. It's just the implementation of making sure everything matches exactly so that it's compatible with everyone else's kind of UIDs.
I mean, how do you verify this? I mean, obviously, you looked at the spec, you wrote according to the spec. I'm guessing you wrote some tests ahead and looked deeply at the code.
Yeah, I mean, I have tests for testing like a few test cases that I know like the exact output for. I tested for like making sure that I can generate 10 million unique ones, which is a requirement because there's a specific implementation detail for it. But the specs usually have what they call vectors. It's usually a security thing. Most common like security specs for security algorithms, and they have like the whole process where they give you like the input and all the transformations that happen in between and the output. So while I don't necessarily test the in betweens, I do have tests for the input and output portion for like the whole entire like set of vectors, and that gives us a reasonably good accuracy that you have implemented it correctly. And then I just added a bunch of extra stuff for my own implementation and Dart specific things, like const constructors and stuff like that.
I mean, you're talking about again also like this nano microseconds thing. I mean, Dart isn't by any means slow, but I mean, if you're working with like JavaScript, obviously it's gonna be much slower, like in the web, right? So how specific can you really be with this in terms of like getting that kind of precision?
I mean, you can be as specific as your time precision allows you to. So, and again, there's only so much information you can fit inside the UUID. So going up to nanoseconds isn't really important. Milliseconds is all you really need to do. So by going all the way to nanoseconds, you're just kind of skipping parts of the implementation, so you don't have to deal with it. But by having to do milliseconds to be like compatible with JavaScript and the Dart default implementation, you still have to. It requires you to implement like the clock sequence counter portion, the node portion, and like you have to implement the entire spec properly for it to function properly. But the spec itself only really requests millisecond precision. So anything more than that is just what people use. Like some languages don't really, when you select like milliseconds from epoch, you have that or nanoseconds or something like that. So I didn't have to really deal with that outside of just implementing it properly.
Okay. I mean, let's kind of roll back a little bit. Like, how did you even get into UUIDs to begin with? Because that's a very complicated thing.
I started out as a backend engineer in my career. Nowadays, I'm a DevOps engineer. But back then, Node.js was all the rage, and all of a sudden, Dart comes out onto the scene. And I use Node.js for the backend portion of it because I do backend work, and they saw Dart as a potential as a great alternative to Node.js in the backend. So my focus is always on backend Dart, which isn't necessarily that popular nowadays. But back then, it was like one of the main things outside of the front end work. So I actually made a bunch of libraries. I have the UID library, I have OTP. I even tried to do a Sinatra style HTTP handler framework for a while, but I kind of stopped that as it didn't really take off. But I've been kind of using Dart from the beginning, and when in the beginning there was no UUIDs for Dart, there was nothing in the standard library. But I do backend development, so I needed UIDs, so I implemented it. And back then there was no AES implemented. There's no crypto library, like a central crypto library. So I ported a JavaScript AES like a library to Dart and was using that internally for a while until a more central crypto library came out onto the scene. I started using that instead. So yeah, that's what got me into UUID. Like it was just necessity, really. And I really liked the language, so I was like, I wanted it to succeed. So I got a lot of like core function, like core libraries implemented just for my use, but for others to use too.
But you're using Dart on the back end in your work.
No. I used to. This is like 10 years ago, like when Dart first came out. I was using Dart for my own personal backend work. I have never used Dart in a professional setting. There's no company that I work for that I worked with Dart. One of them did use it for front end stuff, but I wasn't on those teams because I'm not a front end dev.
Yeah, I got that part, but I mean, like, what were you doing with it like back then? Because even now, it's for. I mean, when you're saying back end, you're talking about like working with a database, accepting HTTP requests, or like what are you actually doing in the back end with it?
Yeah, I was mostly just making web servers and like little app things. Most of it was just personal projects, nothing major. But I knew that others would need it, so I built the libraries more for others than for me. Because again, I like Dart as a language, so I wanted it to succeed. So I wanted it to have the tools that others would need, trying to join onto the ecosystem.
That's interesting because usually people build it for themselves and then they're like, well, I guess other people probably need this, rather than saying, okay, people probably need this, and I do, so let me build it for others, and then it's obviously byproduct is me. It's a little bit selfishness. That doesn't seem right for normal people.
I don't know. I don't really remember what I was thinking at the time. It's been a while, but I don't necessarily think it was for truly selfless reasons. I think the me part was big enough where it felt necessary, but it was just a good combo of both of those requirements.
I understand. I kind of like to hear more about your, just real quick to talk about that experience of the back end, because you're saying like 10 years ago. I mean, 10 years ago, I guess we had Shelf. I mean, what was life like back then before Shelf?
Well, this was before Shelf. Shelf was the reason I stopped working on my Sinatra fork or fort.
maybe you can give us some history, because I don't know what life was like for HTTP before Shelf, because Shelf is like the core of every backend at the moment.
You use the HTTP like the HTTP like the library directly. Like you would set up a server, you would hook into there was like a single function that you pass into the HTTP server that would get all requests, and you would have to partition them out yourself to the proper handlers that would do the work. So when I was writing like the Sinatra port thing, I was doing all that. Like there was a loop, and that would just constantly read from the socket and just pass the things based on pattern matching and all that stuff. Like I was using the built-in HTTP library, so I wasn't like parsing raw HTTP requests or anything. Like there was some like help from the standard library, but that's it's a lot like using HTTP and Go kind of like you get this raw HTTP information, and you can make it as simple as possible for yourself. And but then Shelf came along, so that made things easier.
Well, well, what were you using UUIDs for at this time that you were like, okay, I need to make this package?
Well, I was thinking of using Dart as a general language, and I was really into like again, I'm a backend developer, so working with databases, I needed to put UIDs into a database for uh, like IDs. I knew UIDs were good for like just unique identifiers for user information or item information. It was also the reason I got into programming as a teenager was I wanted to be a video game developer. Uh, but then I was really into MMOs as a genre. So I knew if I ever wanted to make an MMO, I needed to store information in a database and have it uniquely identifiable. So I used UUIDs in other like languages that were already built in. And when I got to Dart, I'm like, well, I need UUIDs. Like, I need to be able to do this. So there we go.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. I mean, um, okay, I mean, the other thing I have to ask is, I mean, it's a long time to working on this. On Well, you're not working on only one package, right? Because we talked before the show that you have that you're like, what? Why this package?
I mean, nowadays I only have three packages that I really maintain because I don't use Dart that actively. Just again, because the backhand side didn't really hit off as much. So, and I don't really do a lot of front end work. So Flutter, why I use it from here and there for my own kind of like little attempts at a project. I never really use it for anything nowadays. Um, but I maintain the UID library, the OTP library for one-time passwords, and the base 32 library, which is used for, it was necessary for the OTP for the one-time password library for like for making the little strings that people paste in as secrets. You needed base 32 for those. So those are the three that I still maintain. I had a few attempts at a few other packages where I wanted to make like DevOpsy tools in Dart, like similar to Capistrano in Ruby or something, where you could manage servers with it. But that didn't really hit off, and I kind of just used Ruby tools back then because I was working at a company that was using Ruby for DevOps stuff, like Chef and so on. But for Dart, like those are the three main ones. I was again attempted at doing a HTTP middleware kind of framework, but it's a lot of work to do that. And I just as I was like midway through it, Shelf came out. I'm like, okay, well, Shelf exists. There's really not a huge reason to build this. So I kind of just archived it and moved on.
Well, that's interesting. I mean, you and me have kind of a, I don't know. I used Ruby quite a bit before. Obviously, I'm familiar with Sinatra and Shelf. I mean, I'm kind of curious. Uh, what do you think? For me, the Shelf stuff kind of reminds me of a lot of like Rack in Ruby. Is it kind of similar to a certain extent?
Yeah, I agree with that. That's a valid assessment. To be fair, I didn't really use Shelf much because um, at the time I wasn't using Dart professionally for anything, so I didn't have any projects that needed a web framework at the time. And by the time I did need something like Shelf, Dart backhand wasn't really going anywhere as much. So I just never built with Chef specifically. But I've read the like the APIs and such, like the docs for it. So yeah, I think Rack is a good comparison to what I remember.
Yeah, because to me, it's kind of like a standard where you can plug it into different HTTPs and things like that, if it's shelf compatible.
Yeah, it's a lot more flexible than what I was building. Like, it was designed to be something you can build on top
Hmm.
of. Um, I think shelf was, at least what I remember from it, it might have changed over the years since then, but like, um, I felt it was a good foundational like system like Rack, where you could build things on top of to make things easier to work with. Like, so um, that's kind of how I saw Shelf being more of a foundational library for other bigger, better things.
Okay. Yeah, I was kind of curious if other people thought the same thing. And it sounds like my kind of assessment was was seems to be in line. Um, I mean, so kind of going back, like working as for UUID for over 10 years. I mean, what kind of keeps you working on it? Because you're not really using a lot of Dart these days, right?
I guess my own pride. I just want to make sure that it keeps working for those that need it. I know that's used by a lot of other like libraries and tools. I mean, I've had pull requests and bug reports from Google employees that use it internally for like Google stuff, like little apps and such. So, like, I know that it's used very heavily. And to be fair, I have, um, in certain regards, thought about trying to hand it off to someone else. Um, I don't want to do that lightly though, because having seen what happens in the Node.js world, I don't want someone just kind of co-opting it and using it for malicious purposes, especially for such a library. So I've kind of thought about that, but at the moment, I still kind of enjoy fixing the bugs. Adding the new UIDs was a really fun thing to do because I kind of refactored the entire library from the ground up. Um, and yeah, I mean, just kind of more of uh, a pride thing. I think it's a something that I've worked on a long time and just want to make sure it works for others still. Like, and to be fair, it doesn't require a lot of maintenance.
Yeah.
Uh, Most of the bug reports I get are, um, actually, I don't really get much bug reports. Either it's most of the bug reports are people just not understanding like the flags that I have for it, so they ask like, "Oh, it's not working in this situation." I'm like, just do this real quick, and then I try to update the docs to be more clear. Um, or they require like, or new features in Dart are added, like nullability or null safety,
Hmm.
sorry, and constant constructor const classes and stuff like that. So I'm like, okay, let's add those because they're being requested. And then someone wanted an object for the UIDs, so then I added objects, like object functions for UIDs, so that you get an object out of it, stuff like that. So there's not a whole lot of work anymore nowadays on it.
Was it really like, was it originally just like a string of all the characters before?
Yeah, originally I just returned it. I had two functions. One returned would return the bytes into a buffer, like a list of some sort, a byte list, or it would return it as a string that's like hexadecimal, the standard UID format. But then people wanted the object form, and then they wanted better null safety was a big thing. So I managed to update that, and then over the years, the thing is vastly different from when I originally like built it. And to be fair, when I built it originally, I was using a Node.js library, an MIT licensed one, to kind of just like use as a reference to build it. You couldn't copy and paste, obviously, but there was enough kind of similarity that I could like port it pretty easily. But, and I think I even, in the original, like, I think for version 1, 2, and 3 of it, or 1 and 2, I included the original author as part of the implement, like as a credit or something of the Node.js library.
So now have you diverged enough that you're saying, okay, this is now kind of a not much.
Yeah, it's definitely, especially with the version 4 kind of refactor that I'm doing with the new UIDs, it's completely a new implementation. So like, it's completely unique to Dart in terms of the way I have it designed.
I guess the kind of like the next question is like, what's next for the UUID package? I mean, did you already add all the new features for Dart 3?
Yes, I mean, UID should be updated to all the latest features, to my knowledge, that I'm aware of. I tend to Keep an eye on just new major versions and what's changed, and if there's anything I need to change, I do it. And Dart 3 was one thing I did. I also have added, there's a version 4 beta for UUID, which has the complete refactor that I did, and version 6, 7, and 8 of the UUID draft spec. So people can play with that want it. And then once it becomes a final spec change, I'll make any remainder changes. But I've been kind of involved with implementing the UUID 6 stuff since early on, so it's been kind of there for a while. Yeah. I mean, I'm pretty much expecting bug reports for anything that doesn't work quite right, and just maintenance from there. Because again, it's not something too complex, but could have bugs here and there.
Yeah, I also want to kind of touch more base on you kind of looking at handing this off to somebody else. Are you still looking to do that? Would you like to kind of make that plea, or you're on the fence still?
I mean, I've been kind of casually doing it. I originally opened a issue on the Dart Lang like repository in GitHub, saying that I want to try and hand it off. My deal originally was maybe merge it, like trying to get it into the Dart SDK or standard library directly, so that it's no longer a library, because it's such a kind of, I feel like UIDs are a fairly common and important feature for most languages. But while they agree that it's important, they didn't want it in the standard library. So they said they would help me find someone that looked like that could take it over at some point. And then I was in the Dart community Discord, and I vaguely mentioned something similar. And there was someone that mentioned that there was a Flutter dev group that could take it over, and told me a name to ping in that issue. And they said they'd take a look and discuss it if they want to take it on or not. So that's like more of a casual conversation. I'm not in a rush. And I want to make sure that it's transferred to someone that actually cares and doesn't want to use it for anything malicious, obviously. But I wouldn't just hand it off like just willy nilly.
I mean, malicious. I mean, I always hear there's a lot of Node.js packages that have secret miners in there for crypto.
Exactly. That's exactly what I'm worried about, because again, UID is used by a lot of tools and packages, and I just don't want that to worry about that really, or at least be more confident that I've passed it off to someone that will care about it. While I do want to pass it off at some point, because again, I'm not really as involved in Dart nowadays. I maintain it for the foreseeable future than do it, like pass it off incorrectly in a sense.
I'm kind of curious about your criteria. Like, how do you know if this person would be the right person to do that?
Well, I would ideally not pass it off to one person, but maybe ideally to like maybe some kind of collective or a group that would maintain it. Just one person would probably be one criteria that I would eliminate them effectively, because I feel that just puts too much emphasis on one person to continue maintaining it. While if it's part of a collective or a group that maintains this, like further, even if people leave and join that group, there's still someone that might look after it, and it's less likely to be used for something malicious, because there's probably like a governance body in that group, or at least multi-person decision making and stewardship. So I think a single person pass off would not happen ideally. So that's one main criteria.
It's interesting because you're also a single person, right?
Yes, and that's partially why I want to pass it off, because I became a father recently, and I don't have the time to really work on a lot of side projects. But at the same time, the reason I want to pass it off is one time, but also that one person thing. If God forbid something happens to me tomorrow, for whatever reason, all of a sudden the library dies or needs to be forked for someone else to maintain it. This way, there's less user customer kind of impact, and it'll be maintained by someone nicer, or a group. Like even if I join a group and maintain it for a while for that group, that would be fine for me too, as long as there's more than just me. Like if I'm just really busy or just can't get to it, and I can just ping someone in that group saying, like, can you take care of this bug or whatever, or something like that. I don't know. Like it definitely needs to be controlled by more than one person. Is my philosophy.
You gotta increase the bus factor, basically, right?
Exactly. And the only reason it's just me is because I created the library. No one else has kind of wanted to take it over because there's again not much work to do. Like I'm just fielding bugs like once or twice a year, or whenever there's a new Dart feature.
Yeah. So the input, or the what do you call that? The amount of effort required at this moment is not much, unless there's language change or whatever.
Exactly. There's a little bit more work now just because I'm adding a whole bunch of new features in the refactor, but it's been working. Tests are passing. All my tests are passing for all versions that I support. And most of it is just like if someone has some weird internal edge cases that they like hit that I'm not aware of that I might be able to handle inside the code. But most of the beta aspect of it is because the 6, 7, and 8 are not final spec versions. And I was kind of hoping, and it's going to happen sometime in the next month or so, I believe, that'll become final based on my understanding. So I'll probably release the final version around when that becomes final. But the beta should be stable. People can use it now. I get not necessarily paranoid, but I really want things to be like clean before I say this is the final version, even if it already works really well.
Okay. I mean, so I guess to ask about, upcoming features, right? It sounds like if there's any changes in the language itself, those would be done.
Yep.
If there's any bugs, those would be fixed.
Yep.
New versions of UUID, when those are finalized, those would be done. There's really nothing else, right? Is there anything else
Yeah.
that's in your mind?
No.
It's pretty much a complete package then.
It is a complete package. It's effectively in maintenance mode nowadays. A few years ago, I was even thinking of making a generic package that handled multiple hashing systems like Ulid and XID and Snowflake and UID, and just jumble them all into one package so people can just pick and choose. But then time got the best of me, and I never even got started on that. So if someone or some future maintainer or someone else wants to take the code and merge it into a bigger package of just um, unique identifier systems, that'd be cool. That's an effort. I don't see a whole lot of implementations in Dart for like XID or Snowflake or all the other possible um, new ones nowadays. So if someone's interested in this kind of stuff, there's still work that can be done in Dart for new features. UID is just not really one of them anymore.
Yeah. It's really we had another recording actually yesterday talking about it's called box transform. Basically, it's kind of I think that UUID package is in a similar boat where it's like there's quite a bit of effort to get it going, and when you use it, it looks simple. That's because there's so much underneath the hood that's happening that people just don't realize, and it takes quite a bit of effort, and people just don't recognize or appreciate the effort put into that, right?
Yeah, I would feel that's similar to UID and my other two libraries. They seem simple, but you have to understand like the algorithms involved and how like cryptography can be evolved or random. Like just the difference between math random and crypto random changes a lot of things. One of the things I think need to be like I think it was the OTP library needed cryptographically secure random number generation, and or even the UID might has the option for it, I believe, which generates was needed for certain fields where you need a cryptographically secure random number. You can't just use math random. So there's little things like that, and having kind of like masking that from the user to make it easy to use is the hard part because now you have to figure out how to use math random and a crypto random from the same function, but without impacting the user's kind of user experience. And in the UID implementation. I just have a util library called util where there's a crypto function and a math version of it, and it defaults the math one. And if you need cryptographically secure, you just pass in the crypto one. You don't have to implement it yourself. You just pass in as an option, and that will get you what you need. So there's stuff like that. There's just a lot under the hood of just kind of branching and handling a bunch of variations. Also handling customizability, like if you want to pass a custom seed or a custom clock or a custom portion of it for any reason, or generate it differently from what I want to generate it. That's all part of the spec. So that needs to be implemented. But again, still made kind of transparent to the user and kind of easy to use. Like the default case should be call a function with 2 pieces of information. While if you really want something off the beaten path, you can do it, but it's going to take time to like read through the docs, figure out what to pass.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I really love UUIDs, and I think we did use this package in one thing, and that was actually to generate UUIDs to insert into a database.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like that's probably the more common use case for it, or to generate random tokens for like, I don't know, tickets or something. But it's still injecting UUIDs into a database is probably 90 to 99% of the use case for it.
I mean, you could also use it to generate the keys for your widgets in Flutter too, I think, but that may be a little bit overkill, but doesn't it'll definitely make it random or unique, I would say.
Yeah, that's true. Or if you need to have them sortable, you can use the new UUID version 6 variation, where it's the same as version 1, but they put the time in the front instead of in the back. So you can now sort properly by the beginning of the UUID, because it's now just the time sort. And 7 is the same way. So you just a more modern version of UUID. So UUID v6 is designed to be just a rearrangement of v1. So in a lot of cases, there's even functions where you can convert a v1 to a v6 just by moving things around and flipping the version number. Version 7 is a completely new modern version where it's like more precision for time. You can actually insert nanosecond precision into your UUID, and focuses more on random data versus like MAC addresses and other stuff. So it has stuff, you can do stuff like that, but the default recommendation is to use as much random data as possible while still using time to sort and such.
For the MAC address part, something that always made me wonder is like nowadays, I mean, you have Ethernet, you have Wi-Fi, you may even have multiple Ethernet ports. Like, how does it choose which MAC address to use? It just picks one, or it picks the first one?
I mean, that's usually provided by the user as part of the function. You would set it as the node. That's why it's called node, because it's like the server node. You would usually insert MAC address information in that. I forget off the top of my head the actual implementation of how it's used, but it was designed so that 2 computers next to each other on the same network would generate unique identifiers without knowing anything about each other. So it has its use case even today, but with time and random numbers being as accurate as they are today, it's not as important. And if you really, really, really need that kind of thing, you can also use version 7 as a version 8, and then just insert whatever additional data you want into it, or customize the implementation how you want. I think that's where version 8 is going to be used most of, is to take an existing UUID implementation and just kind of tweak it to something slightly different, either to add more information, more randomness, or a different time format. Like my version 8 has the time format in human readable form in the hex, so that in the string, so that you can actually see what the time of the UUID is just by looking at the UUID without having to parse the milliseconds from epoch portion of it. So, and that's just something I thought would be interesting, but it's, again, version 8 is kind of a Wild West.
Well, that's what always worries me is when you have this kind of Wild West style, then people will be doing whatever.
Yeah, but that's the whole point of version 8, and you have to put the version 8 version number in it. So, like, you can always tell what version of UID is by looking at I think it's the first or the second segment of 4 digits. So you have the first segment, which is like 8, and you have a segment of 4. In that segment, the first number is the version of the UID. So it'd be 1 through 8, and all version 4s have a 4 there. All version 7s have a 7 there. So you always know what version it is. So if you get a version 8, you know, okay, this is something completely, could be anything. And I think version 8 is going to be used very infrequently. I think it was added purely for future proofing purposes and for vendor specific stuff. I think version 8 is going to be the least used one of the bunch that's added. Version 7, I think, is going to be the most used for new stuff, and version 6 is kind of a compatibility to version 1 kind of thing.
Yeah, like you said, I guess it does make sense if you can have UIDs and then you can stick some more information in there. That does make some sense. That would be used more internally.
Yeah, and version 8 also includes the concept of namespaces, but also has the concept of hash spaces. So you can use different hashing algorithms and know which algorithm it's using by using a hash space, which is like, it looks like a UID, but you just kind of like effectively combine the two to get a new UID out of it. And then you know that if you can use certain different hash, like you can use SHA-256 or 384 or SHA-3 if you want. There's a lot of hash spaces right now, or even Blake2 if you really wanted to. But it allows you to really adjust a lot of knobs. What's V8? What they use for V8 is.
Okay. Well, I mean, I think we talked and we got good kind of roundabout UUIDs, and there's basically somewhat of a call for assistance or takeover for the package, right?
Yeah, I mean, again, it's not urgent. It's not like I'm being overwhelmed with stuff, but I just don't want it to rot either. I think it's an important package. So, I mean, I'm perfectly capable of maintaining it for the foreseeable future. Even if it takes 2 years to find a proper new steward for it, that's how long it takes. I'm just kind of calling it out that that's going to happen at some point. But until then, I'm going to keep it updated and maintained until then.
Now, you did mention you're a father, right? You're not considering to breed the person to take it over, right? It's not part of this plan.
No, that may be a little. It's going to take that'll take too long for that kind of thing. Like my youngest or the one that's here is only like a year and a half, and I'm having a second coming soon. But that's 10+ years before they can even worry about coding.
Well, you're building your team right now, right?
I am, but I mean, UID needs a maintainer until.
Yeah, but hey, you would never imagine you'd still be working on this 10 years later, right? So nobody knows.
That is true. I did not expect to be maintaining UID so long into Dart's lifetime. I generally thought it's like years ago it would just end up in the standard library by like someone at Google implementing it can finally retire it. But no, those things are still external libraries, so is what it is.
Yeah, I can imagine why that's probably not in there. And there's always this kind of thing like, do we add it? If we do, then if there's a problem with that, then we have to release a new version of Dart with the fix. There's a lot of this kind of stuff.
Yeah, that was part of the issue in the conversation. If people can find the issue if they want in the issue tracker. I think it's for the standard library. It's in there, I think. But it's probably the only ticket related to UIDs. But yeah, there's like conversation between me and Google Dev that's saying like, look, we talked about it, but it's not the right place. The standard library is not the right place for it, based on a lot of factors. So it makes sense too. But yeah.
Okay. Well, again, thank you for coming on and talking about your UUIDs and also about your other packages.
No problem.
Those are also extremely useful. And I didn't even know, was it base 32? I didn't even think that was even a thing. I always remember base 64, never really base 32.
Base 32 is a way to get some nicer, shorter, or nicer, more readable hashes. It doesn't have symbols and stuff like that. And depending on which alphabet you use for it, if you use like Crockford's, for example, it doesn't have I's and O's. And like there's stuff like that.
Okay. Well, again, thanks for coming on, and maybe we'll have you back on again in the future.
I'd be happy to be on. Thank you for having me.